Melbourne historically had different operators for their railways and their tramways. Not counting the private companies that came before them, the operators were the M&MTB and the Victorian Railways. You'd expect the railway company to operate the railways, and the tramway board to operate the tramways, and for the most part, they stuck to this rule. However, there's always one annoying outlier, and in this case, two. In today's video, I'll be covering the tram lines that were operated by the Victorian Railways, the St Kilda and Brighton line, and the Sandringham-Black line. Inception. We can't really talk about the inception of these tramways without talking about Sir Thomas Bent, a man who I've mentioned a few times before, as he was the Commissioner for Works and Railways from 1881 to 1883. However, the story for the tramways starts a little bit before that. Around the 1860s, Bent started buying up land in Brighton, and then he started developing new land near Moorabbin. In fact, he pretty much developed the entire suburb of Bentley, which was also named after him. After becoming the Railway Commissioner, to make his land even more valuable, by fast-tracking the building and opening of the Mordialloc line on the 19th of December 1881, which had a station at Bentley. Clearly, the least corrupt politician we've had. After his short stint as Commissioner, he had a few more years in property development and sitting on the backbenches of politics. He then moved to Port Fairy and started dairy farming, and then he came back in 1900, and then he became the Railway Commissioner again in 1903. Just like he did a few decades prior, he started buying up land in Brighton, and then with no affiliation at all, he approved the construction of a tram line running from St Kilda to Brighton Beach, coincidentally running past his property, and this would just so happen to jack up his property prices. Then he became the Premier of Victoria in 1904, which is just another can of worms. The St Kilda to Brighton line. St Kilda to Brighton was the first line built, so we'll talk about it first. St Kilda to Brighton opened on the 5th of May 1906, with a small fleet of wooden-bodied trams. However, this arrangement wouldn't last. It turns out that wooden-bodied trams are really good at catching fire, and that's exactly what happened. On the 7th of March 1907, a fire broke out at the depot, which destroyed all trams, the tram shed, and the offices. Apparently, the fire melted the previous day's coins into a mass of silver and gold, which just shows you how intense the fire was. Of course, you can't have a tram service without trams, and an omnibus service was installed as a temporary measure the following day. The VR turned desperate and looked towards New South Wales for help. They purchased 7 Sydney tram cars to use for the time being. In the meantime, Newport Workshops was producing 14, 7 motors and 7 trailers, replacements to replace the replacements, with 2 new car sheds constructed at Elwood Depot to replace the destroyed sheds. Just as Bent hoped, residential development increased in the area, likewise patronage on the tramway. The line was duplicated from St Kilda to Elwood Depot by 1913. A modernisation scheme created through community backlash forced the VR's hand, and the rest of the line was duplicated in 1915. More powerful and modern trams were planned to be introduced, and the Elwood Power Station was replaced with a substation, and electric power was sent from the Newport Powerhouse instead. The line started to fall off in terms of investment, and especially compared to the rest of the M&MTB system. The tram started to be referred to by the locals as rickety Kates, particularly the California combination cars. During this time, there was a proposal to extend the line from Brighton to Moorabbin Station along South Road. It might have happened if it wasn't for the war. The war inhibited any maintenance of the line and any upgrades, although the line did have a record number of passengers. After the war, bus routes started to spring up and private motor vehicles were appearing, all competing with the tram line. During this time, there was also a coal shortage due to industrial action, which also shortened power. This meant long wait times between services, and one gap was recorded of being 55 days. The tram line was also in a poor state, with the rails sinking so far into the road surface that the motor casings were being polished by the road, which caused disputes with the local council due to road damage. In 1953, the VR decided to close the line rather than repair it, although there was also fierce opposition, and the largest ever public meeting in Elwood was held. There was some re-evaluation to the closure proposal, and the VR also attempted to just hand everything over to the M&MTB, who refused. With no money for repairs, the line from Brighton Beach to Park Street was closed on the 1st of January 1956. with car 42 operating the last service. 6 months later, car 30 did the last round from Park Street to Elwood Depot. This caused patronage to go 90 degrees on a graph downwards. and in 1958 the line was fully closed. The final tram operated on the 28th of February 1959, being run by Car 28, arriving at Elwood Depot at 12:35 am. Rolling stock. When the line was first opened, 9 single, fixed-wheeled electric motorized tram cars and 8 trailers were built for the line. However, they all caught fire. A temporary omnibus was put in place, as mentioned before, using 6 steam-powered omnibuses just sitting around doing nothing after becoming redundant after operating the tram line from Prahran to Malvern. The new trams that arrived to replace the omnibuses were 4 Sydney C-Class trams 18 to 21 and 3 D-Class trams 15 to 17, using salvaged bogies from the destroyed trams to convert them to broad gauge, and they were put into service by March 1907, although the narrower bodies combined with higher broad gauge pony trucks made them really unpopular with everyone. The next addition to the fleet was 7 California combination cars 1 to 7 and 7 toast rack trailers 8 to 14 to go along with them, with the new trams entering service in July 1907, and they were a similar appearance to the Sydney D cars. And speaking of the Sydney cars, they were all withdrawn in 1913, with 9 trams based on the Sydney J-Class trams built and introduced the same year. The new cars were also not popular, and not suitable with the ladies' fashion of the day. 20 new original tram cars, 28 to 47, were delivered from Newport workshops in 1917 to 1932, and this time they were all bogie trams, although they didn't enter service until 1918 because World War I was gobbling up all the electrical equipment. A third car shed was installed at Elwood to house the new fleet. Numbers 44 to 47 were still under construction when they were offered to the M&MTB, as patronage on the line did not meet expectations, although they were building their own standardized bogie trams in the form of the W class, so they declined. With the opening of Jollymont workshops in 1917, the electrical equipment was overhauled in the electrical shop. No new trams entered service until 1942, with 3 cars, 52 to 54, based on the SW6 trams on the M&MTB, which were built from cannibalized parts from the 4 cancelled cars, allowing the California cars to be withdrawn from service. However, they did make an appearance here and there when the other trams were out for repairs, before they were all scrapped in 1956, with the remaining trams lasting until the line's full closure in 1958. Route. Let's start at St Kilda. Something which I don't believe appeared anywhere else in Victoria is a tram line which leads into a train line, and vice versa. This was made possible due to the tramway being the same gauge as the railway. This made transferring items to the systems really easy. In this photo you can also see an overhead wire inspector. The tram waiting area was entirely at ground level, so if you were in a wheelchair or had a pram, you might have had a few problems. Then again, trams did have guards and a driver that could assist you. Atop the canopy of the waiting area, there was a sign saying, "Electric trams to Brighton, leave here every few minutes." After the tram service ceased, the sign was changed to buses to Elwood and Brighton, leave here at frequent intervals. The VR line departed St Kilda and does a straight shot across Fitzroy Street into Grey Street. The line curves south to Barclay Street, passing the Ackland Street terminus, and turns onto Mitford Street. The line curves with the street to align with Broadway and goes over the Elster Creek. It then crosses the defunct Port Ormond tram line at Glen Huntly Road and curves onto Ormond Road, where there is another crossover at Voltaire Street. The line turns once more onto St Kilda Road, and at Head Street is where the tram depot was located, which has now been taken over by several small apartment blocks. Elwood Depot had 8 roads, with 4 of those roads, 5 to 6 and 7 to 8, connected by a small loop. The line continues down St Kilda Street, reaching the final crossover at Park Street and terminating right outside Brighton Beach. Sandringham to Beaumaris. On the 2nd of September 1887, the Brighton Beach rail line was extended to Sandringham. This was the height of the Victorian land boom, and Bent, remember him, was making sure land south of Sandringham was developed. He sought permission to build a tram line from Sandringham Station along the coast to Beaumaris, and then inland to Cheltenham Station, with a branch from Beaumaris to Mordialloc. A contract was drawn up and signed between the Shire Council and the Beaumaris Tramway Company in February 1888 to allow the construction and operation of the tramway by the Tramway Company. The first part of the line to Cheltenham was built at a cost of £20,000 and opened that Christmas, although the Mordialloc line never came to be. The line never lived up to its full potential, and the land boom bubble burst in 1891. and development in the area was halted. The Beaumaris Tramway Company was kept afloat through tourism, keeping the line alive for the next few years, until 1912 when Beaumaris to Cheltenham was abandoned. The Beaumaris Tramway Company ceased all operations in mid-1914, although Sandringham-Black was still developed and a busy place. A local group campaigned for the extension of the Sandringham line, being unhappy with the service brought by the former tramway company, and the Sandringham South Railway extension was considered in 1910, but was rejected due to high land resumption costs. The alternative was an electric tramway from Sandringham to Black Rock, which used a more inland route, and it was passed in November 1914. Unlike the last VR tram line, this tram line was actually supposed to be standard gauge, similar to literally every other tram in the state, which was a really weird deviation from the standard, or should I say broad. The project was delayed by World War I, as materials were hard to come by, with both rail and electrical equipment in low supply. It was delayed for 4 years until it finally opened on the 10th of March 1919, with the first tram leaving for Black Rock at 4 PM in the afternoon, with a crowd of 1,500 people watching the first tram number 22 going off. A small free road depot was built at Sandringham Station inside the railway yard. The line was built as double track from the get-go, except the small section between the depot and the terminus outside Sandringham being single track. The station master at Sandringham was placed in charge of traffic for the tramway, which was a really strange job for the station master to do, as you'd expect traffic to be handled by traffic at head office. Beaumaris residents wanted public transport again and lobbied for an extension of the Black Rock line, but were thoroughly disappointed when they were rejected in 1916 and again in 1919, with the extension finally being approved by the Sandringham City Council in 1925, and the first service ran on the 2nd of September 1926, hauled by car number 51, with 2 of the oldest residents in the area cutting the ribbon across the tracks, although other sources say it was opened on the 1st. The extension cost £52,000 to complete, and trips would take 26 minutes each way. Although the extension was still not a success, as development still had not occurred in the area. And 5 years later, tram number 25 did the last trip to Beaumaris on the 31st of August 1931, with the line making a loss of £18,500 in its 4 years of operation. The remaining section of line was still bleeding money, and the VR borrowed Y1613 to test single-man operation, which was a success, and cars 50 and 51 were modified to allow for single-man operation, completed at the M&MTB's workshop in 1938 and 1934 respectively. The Black Rock Tramway also had a passenger spike during World War II, actually making its first profits. Although it wasn't maintained, and coupled with the increased traffic, the line was very run down by the end of the war. In June 1945, the VR announced that it intended to close the line and replace it with an omnibus service. Just like the Brighton line, this sparked another load of community opposition. After 11 more years, the tramway became even more run down beyond repair, and the line closed on the 5th of November 1956, with the last tram hauled by number 51, which was absolutely packed. The service was instead replaced by a bus route. Rolling stock. 6 of the crossbench cars, 22 to 27, and 6 trailers, 8 to 13 on the Brighton line were converted to standard gauge and transferred from Brighton to Sandringham to run the tramway from day one, with staff at Sandringham Depot undertaking the maintenance of track and rolling stock. 4 new bogie crossbench cars were ordered in 1921, 48 to 51, basically the same as the Brighton ones, just on standard gauge. The 6 trailers were scrapped as they were no longer required with the added stock. In 1938, 4 crossbench cars, 22, 24, 25 and 27 were scrapped, and the remaining 2 were retained as standby cars. The remaining trams ran on the line until closure. Route. Similar to St Kilda, the tram line is on the other side of the railway platform, although no direct tram to train transfer this time. A small passing loop did exist here. This was also the only single track section of the entire line. The line turned east onto Bay Road, and then turns to double track when the line reaches the depot. The line curves southeast onto Fernhill Road, and then east onto Royal Avenue. The line curves south down Bluff Road and reaches the terminus of Black Rock, with 2 crossovers. The extension to Beaumaris curved east and then southeast sharply down Ebden Street, and then east on 4th Street, where a passing loop was located. The line curves south again to Hayden Street, where another passing loop existed, then east along Pacific Boulevard, and then south down Reserve Road. Then the final curve east onto Holding Street and Martin Street until reaching the terminus of Beaumaris, where another passing loop was located. And here's an overlay of the horse-drawn tramway compared to the VR electric one. Very different. Where are they now? After the closure, the VR paid the city councils for the damage to the road surface and to remove pretty much all evidence of the tram lines being there. St Kilda got a pretty good sum, and there's pretty much nothing surviving of the St Kilda to Brighton Beach portion today. The only surviving asset is a tram shelter here on Brighton Beach Road at Dendy Street. Apparently the H crossing with the Port Ormond line still survives underneath the roundabout, which obviously no one has cracked the roundabout open to check yet. As said before, the Elwood depot is very gone, but it was used by Brighton to St Kilda bus lines as their depot until the mid-90s, when it was sold and made into town housing. The Sandringham depot was a bus depot and workshop for the replacement VR buses, but it wasn't privately owned until after Kennet. It's now owned by Melbourne Buslink, however its former entrance cannot be accessed from Bay Street, as a row of shops have been built across the former entrance. That's about it. Nothing else really survives except for the massive amount of trams. On the St Kilda to Brighton line, the free luxury cars 52 to 54 were purchased by the M&MTB, which converted 52 and 53 to standard gauge, with 54 being kept for parts, and it was scrapped in 1967. When 52 and 53 were withdrawn, 52 was acquired by the TMSV, otherwise known as the People Who Operate Bylands Museum, and 53's body was donated to the Newport Railway Museum, although it was later given to the Hawthorn Tramway Museum, and it's actually been restored to running condition. It participated in the centenary of electric tramways in Melbourne celebration and ran to Essendon Depot and Docklands. There are a few other remaining trams in preservation, although I won't go into them. The rest of the tram bodies can now be found all over Victoria. Could it work today? Now, most of the time I pose this question in videos, it's usually no, it wouldn't. However, I think both of these tram lines could work. There was a proposal for a Port Melbourne to St Kilda tram line via Beaconsfield Parade, which was proposed in the early 2000s. Instead of ending at St Kilda, that proposal could continue through Ackland Street down Milford Street along the original alignment. Ormond Road might be a little tight for modern trams, but it shouldn't be too bad either. After reaching Brighton Beach, there would be a few options. Go down South Road to Moorabbin Station, go down Hampton Street to head to Black Rock, or go down Beach Road and parallel the Sandringham line. The line would then go along Balcombe Road and down Reserve Road before following the coast until Beaumaris and Mordialloc or Mentone. Optionally, the Route 96 can also be extended rather than building a new line to Port Melbourne, as the Route 12 is right there. This line would have many benefits. Better connections between Port Melbourne and St Kilda, better connections to Elwood and Black Rock rather than relying on buses, and anyone trying to get to the Brighton bathing boxes from Brighton Beach knows how much of a pain it is, so a tram would link the two up much better. And there would overall just be much better connectivity between the inner Melbourne beaches. While slightly different from the original lines, this new line would provide a much better service. Hello all, I hope you liked this video. While this was a tram service operated by the VR, they also had a few sections of train lines which ran down the middle of roads. The most famous of these was Witchy-Proof, which technically isn't in the road, but is along the grass median in the middle of the road. An even better example of this in Australia would be Denison Street in Rockhampton, Queensland, where there's a full-blown railway museum in the middle of the street. The best example, running like a tram in the Pacific, would be Kiwiland, with the Bay of Islands Vintage Railway running down the middle of Gill Street in Kawakawa. After the line closed, it became a tourist railway. If you want a place to hang out, you should join my Discord, and if you would like to support me further, you should join my Patreon. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you all later.